Hi everyone, happy Victober. And the video I want to do today is a Victober version of a video I did a couple Decembers ago of reading one-star book reviews of my favorite books on Goodreads. So it is a little bit torturous, sifting through the different reviews, trying to find the funny, amusing ones to share with you. Some shots were fired at some of my favorite books, but I did keep the amusing comments of my favorite, critiques of my favorite Victorian novels, and I have for you, Booktuber Reads one-star reviews of her favorite Victorian novels. The first one I picked was Middlemarch. It was not hard to find a lot of salty reviews of this. I know Middlemarch is a very hit or miss book with readers out there. So I'll just read to you the several reviews that I picked. The first one says, page 97, ugh, I'm trying, guys. I really am. But right now I'm about 100 pages into this book, and the thought of getting through the next 700 is making me want to throw myself under a train. And I almost never leave a book unread, so this is serious. However, since it's on the list, I feel I should at least try to give it another chance, but it's not going to be easy. Here in simplified list format are the reasons I really want to abandon this book. It's everything I hate about Austen. Boring dialogue and background information, endless nattering on about who's marrying whom with none of the dry wit that makes her stories enjoyable. Dorothea is an insufferable, stuck-up know-it-all, and I hate her. Also, her sister calls her Dodo in a horribly misguided attempt at affection, and every time I have to read it, it's like a cheese grater to the forehead. She's 19 years old and is marrying a 47-year-old. I just can't. I know it's going to end badly, which makes it slightly better, but come on, Elliot. Page 190. Okay, I need to get to part 5 before I can reasonably stop reading. Hopefully something resembling a plot will happen soon. Page 300. Nope, nothing yet. Page 370. Oh, I don't care. Shut up. Why are you telling me all of this, George Eliot? Why? Page 409. Okay, I tried. No one can say I didn't give this book a fair chance, but I'm halfway through and nothing has happened. I've just read 400 pages of some boring people going about their boring everyday business, and I'm done. Maybe I'm just not sophisticated enough to understand this book's genius. Maybe I can only be happy with a book if the characters are likable, and doing interesting things besides sitting around and thinking about how miserable they all are. Maybe it's just my fault for having a bad attitude about this book from the beginning. Who knows? But what I know for sure is this. I got to my designated halfway point on the flight back from vacation, and when we landed, I made sure to leave Middlemarch on the plane. Hopefully it's adopted by someone who will love it more than I did. Addendum. I just consulted the list to check this book off, and I decided to see if there were any other George Eliot books on it. Including Middlemarch, there are 5 Eliot books I'm supposed to read before I die. 5. I found that review highly amusing. I just think George Eliot's writing did not suit you. It asks a lot of readers, and about her saying Dorothea being an insufferable, stuck-up know-it-all, if I was reading a book where I felt a character was really flawed and it wasn't being acknowledged and they didn't have an arc, of their journey, I would be more frustrated. But because I think that Dorothea does have a lot of growth and maturing that she goes on throughout the book, it doesn't really bother me. Okay, then, let's see here. Pretentious, overly verbose, lacking in any kind of interesting style, and just boring. There was a quotation, Greek or Roman mythology or biblical allusion or pop culture reference of the time in every paragraph. I'm not kidding. Also totally derivative, Dickensian and plotting, but without his momentum, imitative in structure and attempting the class analysis of War and Peace, but nowhere near achieving the latter's historical depth or analysis. Trying for Jane Austen's social commentary, but without her sense of humor or subtlety. The narrator blatantly and arrogantly tells the reader what to think, sometimes unaware of psychological or even logical inconsistencies into which she's forcing her characters for the sake of moralizing. Definitely suffering from the typical pitfalls of the serialized form in which it was originally written. However, there were a lot of quotable lines and home truths scattered among its many unnecessary and overwrought pages, and her dialogue was very realistic. Wish there could have been more dialogue and far less exposition. A good editor would have made a masterpiece out of this mess. A shame that such a brilliant, brave, and interesting woman as George Eliot, who led such an unconventional and fascinating life, couldn't distill all that experience more artfully into her writing. No wonder I'd heard of her, but I'd never heard of any of her books. Then just one line. This is where any kind of love towards literature goes to die. This is the hands down worst book I have ever read. I recommend to all people who like asinine thithers and hithers scattered about the Victorian English countryside. I once had a professor say that you're either a Dickens person or an Eliot person. I seem to fall into the former camp. Sure, Eliot's book is more nuanced, socially aware, and provides detailed characterization, but it's just so girly with all those relationships in it. I prefer Dickens' broad strokes and epic plots. So much I have to say to that last one. Like, if a book is about relationships, therefore it's girly, so men never have relationships? Is that what you're trying to say? Also, I do find that an interesting theory, though, that you're either a Dickens person or an Eliot person. I can kind of see what the professor is saying, although there are some Dickens books that have really knocked it out of the park with me, although I don't think my favorite of Dickens would ever top my favorite of George Eliot. So that's an interesting theory. All right, then moving on to North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. The first review that I noted down just said, tedious. The next one says, well, 1 star means did not like it. It is probably worth a star or 2 more, except for the fact that I wanted to fall into a seizure and or die every time I tried to read it. For the uninformed, this is industrial Pride and Prejudice, which means it's a little less gorgeous and every bit as irritating. I must admit, I read the first third, then got so fed up with it, I just Googled a plot summary and read the last 20 pages so as to get in on the actual romance. The actual romance was the last 2 pages, people. It was completely unbelievable and unsatisfying as a romance, but at least I knew how much I hated it before I went to book club. But if you're the type that likes Victorian-era social novels, you should definitely give it a go. I will say the romance is very subtle. I remember this past time that I reread it, I was thinking there's not quite as much romance as I had remembered happening in it. So it is subtle. All right, the next one says, one of the most boring books I've ever endured. I thought it would never end, and I was so happy when it did. I guess I'm an ignoramus because I didn't realize this book was written in the 19th century. The publication date says 1994. I thought I was reading historical fiction, not a romance from the 19th century. Doesn't change my opinion one bit. Boring, boring, boring. Just glad it is over. Couple things with that one. One, some people have can't even with a book that is kind of all-encompassing. So yes, it has some romance in it, but it's also social commentary, it's also a mystery, and it's also a domestic novel. So they just can't comprehend that. Just so funny how they were like, well, the publication date says 1994. Although I think in many classic editions, it will have the date that the publishing house published it, but then the original publication date. All right, next one for North and South. This is the worst book I have ever read. If you see how many books I've read, you can tell this is quite a statement for me to make. It is boring, stupid, and poorly written, not to mention dry, long, and without a point. Now, I was surprised too, because I clicked on the person who made the review, and they're a college professor. But I don't think they're like an English professor. Just to say it's the worst book you've ever read is a big statement about a classic novel. Okay, this person says, it was so hard to get through and the ending was flat. So much focus on the industrial warehouses, strikes, and worker/employee relationships, blah, blah, blah. What's so funny to me is they say, so much focus on the industrial warehouses, strikes, and worker/employee relationships. It's just critiquing that's what the plot is. So you could say about To Kill a Mockingbird, so much focus on, courtroom time and racism, or War and Peace, so much focus on Russian families and war. Yeah, that's kind of the point of the plot of the novel. Okay, then we move on to Lady Audley's Secret. This is a lesser known one, so there weren't as many quippy, salty one-star reviews, but I did find one, and it says, if you think that spitefulness, oh no, sorry, wrong one. It says, as long-winded as it was tedious, with a pompous style of narration, bizarre and outdated psychology, and an immediately obvious mystery, avoid this book. Two things. One, immediately obvious mystery. That's a pet peeve I have for people who don't typically read mysteries. If they write off a mystery simply because they figured out who done it at the beginning. I mean, I guess if you like a puzzle mystery and just a puzzle mystery, but mysteries are so much more than that. You want to get into the why of the characters, you know, the why done it. And secondly, when they say outdated psychology, a common pet peeve I see of, or a common critique I see of Victorian novels on Goodreads is, this is a Victorian novel with Victorian values written by a Victorian author in the Victorian era. Like, yeah, it's going to have Victorian sentiments. That's when it's from. People are going to look back at the time that we are now and see the sentiments of this era in 100 years, in 200 years, when they look back on books that were written in the 2000s. Anyhow, moving on to Wuthering Heights. I knew I would get some good ones. If you think that spitefulness is romantic and that people destroying their lives is dramatic, go ahead and read this book, but don't say I didn't warn you. Then the next one says, vastly overrated hysterical nonsense. I find myself wondering why this novel attracts so much adoration from modern readers. Is it because it is the only novel by the middle one of the Bronte sisters? The one who died tragically young? Blah-de-blah-de-blah. Has it just been lumped with all the Haworth hyperbole? I find all the Bronte trio deficient when compared with the sheer breadth and of compass of many other 19th century writers. And Emily seems by far the weakest. In fact, I've suspected for a long time that because the parsonage at Haworth, the family home, and many of their childhood artifacts still exist, this may be almost entirely responsible for firing the public's imagination. Some speculation happening there. Okay, next one says, I've read this story 3 times. I obviously have no respect for myself. I read it once when I was 15. I read it again in my early 20s, and I read it a 3rd time after a horrible breakup, the one that broke my heart right before I turned 30. I was in a different frame of mind for each reading, and yet every single time I finished with the same response. I hate this book. I actively hate it. I want all the characters to get a terrible influenza that is so painful and horrific that they suffer terribly, losing their voices so they can't whine about every little thing they love to whine about. And then they die, alone, far from the window panes where they've scratched all their nonsense, far from the moors that contain weather matching their moods and space to match the emptiness in their souls, far from the money bags they have hidden under floorboards or in vaults or wherever they keep all their ill-gotten gains. Ill-gotten because I hate this story and I want to defame it. I want them all to be lonesome, forgotten ghosts, all of them. Ugh. And those moors! Everyone makes them sound wild and magical, harsh but mystical. This book makes them sound damp, cold, solitary, nasty, brutish, and gross, etc. Why so much unlove for the heather-ridden, scraggly, rocky, yet somehow verdant hills? Because nothing in this book is nice. Not people, nothing. It is all one big lump of unpleasant drama. If this were updated, there would be Kardashians in this story. But Erica, you don't generally like nice, so what gives? This is too much. Not nice even for me. Even for me! That's a lot of not nice. I'll read this book again someday when I have dementia and forget that I hate it. I don't really have much to say to that one. It was just highly amusing and entertaining. All right, the next one says, I'm curious to know if ever there were another terrible book that had more heaps of undeserving praise. Several people have recommended this book to me, purporting it to be their absolute favorite. It leads me to question my friendship with them, and if indeed they have ever read any other book. This book's plot is incredibly fatiguing. It is touted as a great tragic romance. I spy no romance, and the tragedy that I was supposed to feel for some of the characters' deaths was smothered by my overall happiness that I would not have to read about them anymore. Indeed, the biggest tragedy of all was the loss of those precious minutes I spent of my limited time on earth reading this absolute garbage. The only thing I gained was an immediate disdain for people listing this book among their favorites. If you are ever curious as to someone's intelligence or devotion when they tell you they love books, ask them how they feel about Wuthering Heights. If they say a word of positive, do yourself a favor and avoid them forever. There are many, many wonderful novels from the 19th century. This is not one of them. Okay, then we have Great Expectations. And this review just starts out quite punchy. Dickens is a jerk. Nobody likes his stuff. They're just afraid to say it because he's supposed to be classy. The man got paid by the word, for crying out loud. Imagine if I got paid to write marching band drill by the dot. I would write a page for every 4 counts of music. What would I produce? A ridiculous tune that nobody will ever get through. And if they ever did, it would be way too hard and too much work. And of course, if you actually did it, you would have to say that I was wonderful. Otherwise, you'd look like an idiot. Like when you buy a new car and somebody asks you if you are happy with it, nobody says, no, I just spent 30 grand on a pile of crap. Thus concludes my critique on Dickens. Those of you young enough can feel free to plagiarize it for your college essays. All right, the next one, he launches into a story. Once upon a time, there was a lumberjack named Paul. Paul and his crew worked in the Pacific Northwest in some of the most lush forests in America. Paul's job was to run a chainsaw, and it was arduous work filled with long hours and danger. Paul loved his job and took great pride in knowing that his work helped provide lumber for homes, heating systems, and occasionally the manufacture of books. Of this last facet, Paul was particularly proud because he was a voracious reader who took literature seriously, a love instilled in him by his high school English teachers. After one particularly strenuous day, in which Paul and his crew labored to fulfill an order for pulping for a book manufacturer, Paul ventured to ask his boss if he happened to know what book was going to be produced with the wood they had chopped down. Why, yes, I do, Paul, said the book manufacturer, much to Paul's surprise. Says here that this wood will be pulped to make 100,000 copies of Great Expectations. Distraught, nay, overwhelmed with immediate grief for his part in the massacre of dozens, if not hundreds of trees for the production of the worst book in the history of the English language, Paul immediately revved the motor of his chainsaw and promptly cut his own head off. The end. This is often considered Dickens' greatest literary achievement. If this is, in fact, the case, I would be loath to read even a singular sentence in any other piece he wrote. It would be a sentence, I am sure, that would be rife with a ridiculous number of commas, semicolons, and repeated phrases, all prodigiously amalgamated to ultimately result in a complete and disastrous mess of a clause. I wish I could give this negative stars. Okay. Next one for Great Expectations. Like most teenagers, I was forced to read this bloated melodrama in high school, and it quickly became apparent that Dickens was being paid by the word. I admit that having a book forced on me always lowers my opinion of it, but there is about enough plot here to make a decent novella, a format to which Dickens might have been better off sticking. This novel, which is really a collected serial, originally published in weekly installments, may well have worked in that format. Soap operas are still quite popular after all, giving their audience a weekly dose of melodrama loosely held together by a vague background story that never seems to go anywhere. The constant attempts to cram it down the throats of high school kids in the course of a week or two by the one kid from his class who actually liked it and then grew up to be an English teacher is probably not best calculated to endear Dickens to a new generation, however. This book has caused me great pain. I hate the fact that I despise Great Expectations. I just hate it. It's one of those books that I started out adoring, my face pressed unhealthily close to the pages as I sucked down every brilliant word of the flawless, eerily haunting beginning. I loved it. I really did, until I got about 200 pages in. Or was it a little sooner? I've no idea. I only remember ending up sitting down one dreary afternoon, my spirits low as I forced myself through the last of the book, and then sighed gratefully, tossing it on the floor, never to look at it again. But I did look at it again, staring at it for a long while and wanting to cry, why do I hate this book? Why? Why? I sound terribly dramatic, but Charles Dickens is a writer I long to love. I want to have long conversations about his brilliant novels and style with a friend and sit sipping tea, picking up another one of his books, twirling my pearl necklace and reading, getting sucked into his works, but I just can't. I know I'm not the only person who hates him, hates this book, but I still can't get over it. I'll give you another chance, Charles, I promise. Okay, this has turned into, it looks to be 20 minutes, so I'm going to make a part 2 of this video so we can spread out the salty humor, and I hope you have enjoyed this, and I will be back with part 2 soon. Bye.